Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Edgar Markov, Vampire Kindred Aggro, or just Vampire Aggro. This is a very strong commander, which we'll get into, and the deck builder wants us to work on a few things, improving the mana base and fixing, and some alternative win cons. They say they don't really have a restriction, but they're trying to keep it below 750 Australian dollars, which is something we can definitely do. Edgar Markov is one of my favorite commanders, though I've never built him myself, and he is incredibly strong and perhaps has a bit of a reputation. But we'll get into that in a second. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Edgar Markov and why are they our commander for Vampire Kindred Aggro? Well, if you don't know, Edgar Markov is probably the most popular Mardu commander and maybe the most popular tribal or kindred deck by far because of that Eminence ability. But he is a 6-mana 4/4 Vampire Knight, which is a lie because you never cast them because of the first Eminence ability. Whenever you cast another vampire spell, if Edgar Markov is in the command zone or on the battlefield, create a 1/1 black vampire creature token. Otherwise, if you do ever cast Edgar Markov, he's a 4/4 first strike haste, and when he attacks, you put a +1/+1 on each vampire you control, which, to be fair, is very strong. But, honestly, you're really playing that Eminence ability. Doubling up every single one of your creatures with an additional 1/1 vampire is really strong. And obviously, in Vampire Kindred decks, that ability is so much stronger. This is an effect you get for free. It's just insane. It's such a strong commander, and if you ever build this, you're gonna feel it. I think it's so strong, and to be fair, a lot of fun. So let's look at the deck itself. I have, as you can see there, copied this deck off of Archidect because I do hate that site, and I've made a nice little Mox field here. And now we can take a look at the deck itself. And you may have seen what I'm about to talk about right away. And it is a 28 land deck. Deck builder, do you hate me? I think it is a thing that is just, I get it. This is a commander that can be incredibly low to the ground, but that's not the current build. We have a build whose curve goes on for a very long time, and we've got 28 lands. It's like we're missing 10, maybe less, let's say 7 lands at least. We've got some nice little inclusions in the instance, and the rest of the vampire group is pretty good. But this deck feels like an exasperation of a problem that I've said other decks have that this deck doesn't really have, where players try to put a very strong collection of non-creature spells in order to make up for a weak creature, deck. But this deck is not weak. This deck is very strong. So this collection of instants that are incredibly powerful feel appropriate, but then the rest of it feels kind of out of place. So let's go through it, see what I can say. I've got some additions, not very many, but enough to get us out of what I would suggest is the tough part of this deck and improve it quite a bit. So starting up right away, obviously we need to go up 7 lands, and those cuts, I would argue, would probably come out of our artifacts really easily. We have, let's see, Signets, Chromatic Lantern, Commander Sphere, Savai Crystal. Honestly, we could just cut every single one of these mana rocks outside of Sol Ring and just turn them into lands. Why? Well, you don't really need mana rocks in a deck like this. If you keep your curve low enough, which we could probably improve with some more 1-mana vampires and 2-mana vampires, you don't need to ramp into anything. Every single one of your vampires summons 2 vampires. And every turn you play a mana rock, you're wasting your time by not playing vampires. So we can cut these pretty easily. After which, I do like our higher mana cards, especially Coat of Arms, which is a card I don't usually like, but the sheer amount of vampires you're pumping out, I think is great. I think these are all really good finishers, from Eldrazi Monument to Obelisk of Erd. You know, these are really good 5 mana spells that almost beat out your higher mana vampires, which I'll get to in a moment. But while we're here, I will say Elixir of Immortality feels a little strange. I get there's a bit of a life gain synergy here on a few cards, but I would like to cut that. I'm going to give you a better alternative win condition. And on that alternative win condition, I'm going to sneak over here to enchantments, and we can see that we have the Sanguine Bond Exquisite Blood combo. Now, if you'd like, you can keep this combination, but I don't really think this is the kind of deck that wants to run it, even though flavorfully, it feels good, right? These are 2 vampire spells. The thing is I just think you're so aggressive. 10 mana over 2 turns and 2 specific cards is just really difficult for you to do. I want a much more aggressive win condition rather than cards that kind of don't do much if they're not both together. Like, Sanguine Bond is pretty strong because as you gain life, people will lose life, but Exquisite Blood is just going to gain you a bunch of life in a deck that doesn't really benefit that much from it. So this is the weaker of the 2, and even then, I don't know. Like, Sanguine Bond is strong, but you have to play both or neither, and I'm kind of going to suggest neither because it just doesn't feel on point here. You're too aggressive to be playing this many 5-drops, and you have too few lands. Looking at our sorceries, we've got another mix of cards that I don't really love. Damnable Pact is strong in a ramp deck, but once again, you're not a ramp deck. You neither will draw enough of these cards, nor will you burn an opponent out by doing this. I would much rather something like Serpent's Pact, I believe. Whoops. Serpents. I'm just typing on the other screen. There we go. Pact of the Serpent. Something like Pact of the Serpent feels a lot stronger because you just, for 3 mana, gain a card for every vampire you control for the same amount of life, which I think is very much so worth it and very strong. Here, I think it's just much better than Damnable Pact, and you'll be happier with that exchange. But outside of Sign in Blood, which I also want to replace, Ancient Craving is too much mana for 3 cards. Symphon Mind, likewise, is too much mana for 3 cards and belongs in a discard deck and not a vampire deck. Kindred Charge is really interesting. I think it's strong, but yeah, I think this is fine. I'm not going to be too complaining about this one. But our last 2 here, because Blasphemous Act is great at 1 mana, but Merciless Eviction does not belong in this deck. You do not want to exile all creatures. You are the threat. Why would you use this as a board clear? You might say, well, Cursed, you could use this to get rid of artifacts and enchantments, but we've got better options down here with Return to Dust, for example. So instead, this is just a very clunky board clear, which I think you can easily just get rid of. Likewise, Ruinous Ultimatum, though, is very strong in this kind of deck, is very mana hungry, and I don't think you need it. I think, honestly, if you want this, like, if you have access to Kindred Charge, I think this is just better. It's 1 mana less, it's more on theme, and with some of the suggestions I'm going to give you, it's more likely to defeat all your opponents. And I think that's much better. Ruinous Ultimatum would be better if you weren't in a creature, you're not in a Kindred deck. It's still going to take me a while to get used to that. You're not in a Kindred deck, and therefore, if you were not in a Kindred deck, this would be better. But since you are, the Kindred Charge is just much stronger. So I cut this as well. Instants are all great. Beacon of Immortality does not belong here. Once again, this is a life gain card in a very aggressive deck. It's 6 mana. You're not going to get to 6 mana. And if you get to 6 mana, you're going to want to cast Kindred Charge or other vampires, not this card. Okay, going past those, Once again, I really like the finishers here. Even Bolas' Citadel, which traditionally doesn't belong in a deck like this, I still think is reasonable here because both modes, excuse me, are very, very good. So with that in mind, let's look at our vampires before we go into additions. I'm making this video actually rather quick, I feel. I think the key part of this deck is a lack of lands. And I can suggest a lot of things, but until we fix up those lands, there's not really much we can do. All right, coming down to the bottom of these vampires, let's see what we've got. So Lycia, I believe, Sanguine Tribune, is a really, really cool card. I do really like her, but you have to build the entire deck around her. But here, you're kind of just playing her very fairly, where she comes out like let's say you use one of the life gain cards and you're able to cast her for 3 mana. She's a 3 mana, what does she become? A 7/7 for 5 life in addition. She also creates a 1/1 because of your commander. And then what? She just, like, she hits hard, she gains you life, but I don't know. She's really good in the command zone because this spell, like, the command tax is removed by the life you gain, and that's really, really strong. But otherwise, she's just a really big beater, and you prefer to go wide rather than tall, so with all that in mind, I don't think Lycia really belongs here. Looking down, we've got Zagras, which once again has a cost reduction, which makes him much better as a commander, and you have to build around party, and I don't know to what degree do you have party. You have clerics. You have a rogue. And I believe there should be a wizard here. We have a shapeshifter, so changeling, that counts. Okay, and there's a wizard there, and I know there's a lower wizard down here. There's another wizard there. So I'm going to suggest that Zagras is really not going to cost that much less, right? A party is a warrior, which you have none, a rogue, which you have very few, a wizard, which you have very few, and a cleric, which you have many, meaning that likely Zagras is going to cost 5. One of your few rogues is Zagras, so even then, I just don't see it. And all it's going to be is a 4/4 flying death touch haste that kills planeswalkers, which you don't really care about, gives your creatures death touch, which you don't really care about. I think this is an easy cut as well. Vona, who I miss. I wish Vona was in this last set. I really, really like Vona. Vona isn't in the set, right? We haven't gotten a new Vona card. No, she wasn't on the expedition. Rest in peace. I do love her. I want to see more of her. But Vona, once again, is kind of a slow card. 7 mana to vindicate. Sorry, 7 life to vindicate. Only on your turn, but you can't give her haste. Not ideal. I think this just belongs in a different deck. You just prefer a smaller vampire so you can get another trigger off of your commander. So I think that's easy to get rid of. Drana, once again, is a 5 mana creature that only has a benefit when she attacks, and then you get the worst creature in your graveyard back in a deck with a lot of low mana, not great creatures whose main benefit is that you get to cast them. Drana just puts them onto the battlefield instead of being able to cast them and get another trigger. So Drana can very much easily be cut. Bloodlord of Vazgoth, or Vazgoth, is interesting. I do like the idea of your vampires coming in with 3+1/+1 counters, but it is cast. It does not enter the battlefield, so it will not affect the tokens that Edgar Markov creates, which means you're still getting 1/1s despite the fact that Bloodthirst is really, really strong. See, it's interesting because Bloodthirst doesn't trigger on cast, but they reworded the Bloodlord so it is on cast, which almost makes it so much worse in this deck than it would be otherwise. I do now see that you're playing Temple of the False Gods with 28 lands. You can't do that. Temple of the False Gods is actually reducing your land count again. So I would cut Temple of the False God completely and just replace it. Okay. Looking at going back to creatures, Bloodline Necromancer is fine. Anawan is okay. I don't particularly like Anawan, but I can see it being fine because it triggers very, very quickly. And if your opponents have only a few creatures, this can be very, very strong. So I don't mind it as much. Looking through the rest, I think the rest is fine. I'm going quickly and I'm covering what I think are the biggest outliers right now. I feel like a lot of these creatures... Right now, my goal is to cut out a lot of the high mana stuff. That way, you only need to go up to like 35 lands, and I think you'll be fine there. But right now, the deck really, really is leaning on its high mana cards, and I think it's really holding you back. When you think about it, this deck really benefits from a lot of 1 and 2 drops, which you can add. I have a few suggestions, but I'm not going to suggest all of them. And with 1 and 2 drops, you can really power out a lot of 1/1s really, really quickly. And I'm going to give you some card draw to kind of supplement that, but I think that should be your main goal. Right now, I feel like this deck is really, really clunky. It has some really, really strong instants to lean on, but outside of that, and a few really strong low mana creatures, but outside of that, it kind of grinds to a halt incredibly fast, whether because it has very much so a land problem, or because it's trying to cast very large mana spells that don't necessarily immediately win you the game, or don't, strengthen your board presence enough. The last two I'll look at are our Planeswalkers, and I do like Sorin Vengeful Bloodlord. I think this is very, very strong here, but Sorin the Mirthless feels just okay and could easily be replaced by something else. And then I'll look at your sideboard, Blind Obedience, Sorin Imperious. I would put the Imperious Bloodlord over the Mirthless Sorin because I think it's much, much stronger. It allows you to hit your opponents with lightning helixes. It grows your vampires. But much more importantly, it lets you cheat out a few of your vampires. Though that doesn't make the trigger off of Edgar Markov, it can let you steal some, get some mana gain by putting out like Sanctum Seeker or... I'm now realizing you aren't playing my favorite 5 mana planes vampire. So let's put 5, draw, vampire. Champion of Dusk, which is really, really strong. With Champion of Dusk, you cheat this out and you draw a bunch of cards. It's basically Pact of the Serpent, but on a vampire, and I would play both. All right. Let's go into some additions. We're flying through this video, and I don't really mind, honestly. I've got some good additions for you, additions here to put in here, and I think let's talk about your alternate win cons. That's what I want to put the first 2 additions. Really, it's not very many, but we can extend it more. So here's the thing. A lot about your deck is going wide, and so our alternative win condition should take advantage of that. So things like Exquisite Blood and Sanguine Bond are great, but require a tremendous amount of mana and drawing 2 very specific cards. Instead, I'd like to lean more into the Cruel Celebrant Aristocrats idea. And I only want to add just like a few cards on that like lane. And I want to add mainly Blood Artist, Bastion of Remembrance, and Viscera Seer. So Blood Artist is kind of the weaker version of Cruel Celebrants, but we're trying to stay low on mana, so we're trying to only use the weaker ones. Well, weaker is maybe not the right word, but the easier to cast ones. So unlike Zulaport Cutthroat, who is not a vampire, though I would actually play both now that I think about it. Blood Artist targets one opponent at a time whenever your creatures die. Zulaport Cutthroat, though not being a vampire, is still worth playing here because it will, every time one of your vampires dies or any creature dies, all your opponents will lose a life. Bastion of Remembrance is the same thing, but it's an enchantment while creating a human soldier, which is not a vampire, but once again, we don't mind. The ability is so strong, it makes up for it quite a bit. This card just got reprinted too, so it's a great time. These things are here, and we'll get to Viscera Seer in a second. Viscera Seer, sorry. These things are just really, really strong because your main weakness is the fact that your opponents are going to try to wipe your board over and over again. And so you're going to try to make a situation where wiping the board actually empowers your deck even further by dealing tons and tons of damage to your opponents. Obviously, once again, our strongest copy is Cruel Celebrant because she is a vampire in addition to hitting all your opponents. But imagine using Kindred Charge with Blood Artist and our Cruel Celebrant out. Now that's a finisher where you attack all of your opponents, and then whatever dies will do tremendous damage to your opponents. Now you might say, but Cursed, what about Exile? What about the Kindred's Charge exiling at the end of turn as well? Well, that's why we play Viscera Seer. Viscera Seer not only is a very strong 1-mana vampire to give you 2 bodies, but they will sacrifice vampires to let you scry, which not only gives you the death trigger, but lets you get rid of the tokens that would be exiled and still get the death trigger. This is also just good because if your opponents are key removing some of your creatures, the Seer allows you to get some benefit out of them before they die or are removed. So this is the combination of cards I would say is your cleanest alternative win condition, the most on theme and benefiting this aggro kind of shell. I still think, like I said, you can still probably play Exquisite Blood and Sanguine Bond, but I think these are just much stronger and you will notice the difference right away. Then I want to go into draw. I think I just want to clean up your draw a little bit. I think the idea isn't bad, but with so few, if we reduce the CMC or the mana value of all your creatures and all your cards, and we increase your lands, you're going to be burning through your hand really, really fast, which is intended. So I don't mind having a few extra draw spells at lower mana to take advantage of it. The easiest one is, I love Sign in Blood, but instead you should really be playing Night's Whisper because it'll be easier for you to cast than it would be than Sign in Blood, right? You've got an additional colorless or generic mana cost. You're in 3 colors. This is a lot nicer. Then I've got 3 others, and I would probably say pick 2 of 3, but you could play all 3. Read the Bones is the one I generally like generically. It's just very good. Scry 2, draw 2, lose 2 is just very, very strong, and it'll enable you to immediately get the cards to cast either that turn or later. Rowan's Grim Search is stronger if you can cast the Bargain, and this deck can definitely cast the Bargain by sacrificing a vampire token, which says, because then it becomes pseudo Surveil 4, it's not exactly that, and then draw 2 and lose 2. So you get the best 2 cards out of 4 cards, and the rest of them, oh no, it's up to 2 on top, so you can actually dig up to 6. So yes, okay, I read it backwards. So this one is really, really strong, and perhaps the strongest of the options, but it does require sacrificing a vampire. Otherwise, it's just a worse Read the Bones. It's just, honestly, it's a worse Night's Whisper at that point. And then the third option is Painful Truths, which is draw 3, lose 3, as long as you pay 1 color of each mana. This is trickier. I would say this one, to me, is the weakest of the 3, but when it works really, really well. Draw 3 for 3 is just very, very strong, but clunky. Finally, I have 3 additional creatures that I'd like you to play. They're fresh from the new set. Definitely the first 2. The last one's kind of expensive, but I think it's good enough to be worth considering. The first one is Master of Dark Rites. Master of Dark Rites is so, so good in this deck. And if it stays around $2, you're going to be very, very happy. Though I believe, yeah, the extended art one's cheaper because you don't have to buy the commander deck for it. This one is so strong. You can cast a vampire, cleric, and or demon spell off of this card that basically dark rituals you. Or is it Culling Rites? I forget which one it is. It's one of those sacrifice a creature, gain 3 black mana. But this is insanely powerful and will be played in a lot of different Kindred decks. So I would pick them up if you like any of these tribes or types, I would say. Regardless, this is really, really powerful because it allows you to push out some of your higher mana cards, specifically, once again, things like Champion of the Dusk or Champion of Dusk, really, really early or at the right time to hold up enough mana to still cast other cards. And the fact that you've got an endless supply of 1/1s makes it even better. Beyond that, I think it's just really, really strong in the sense that it's just good. I think I've already explained it. I don't need to go over it again. It's just a really good card, so I'd like you to play that. Likewise, Dusk Legion Sergeant is a really, really interesting card. Also, obviously being very, very slept on, where it's a 2/2 menace for 2, which is not ideal. propped up by the fact it comes with a 1/1, and then for 1 and a black, you sacrifice it. Each non-token vampire creature you control gains persist, which means if it dies, if it didn't have -1/-1 counters, it comes back. This is very, very powerful, even though it seems like a bit of a nombo with your creature tokens that you're going to be producing. And the main reason for that is that, once again, it works really, really well with our Blood Artist effects and our Cruel Celebrant, because it allows us to preemptively kind of sacrifice creatures. I'm on the wrong card. To sacrifice creatures and gain the benefits, and then after that fact, just get them back. Not even just saying the ability that this allows you to live through board clears. Not all of your creatures, but most of them. Well, I mean, literally half your creatures, because every creature makes a token. So half your creatures will survive, which is really, really good. You'll get the ETBs. You'll have the chance to get another death trigger out of them. The only one you can't bring back is this one itself, because it sacrifices. But you could find ways to reanimate it if you like that. I just think this is really, really good. And the fact that it's at this price, I think you should definitely pick that up. Then let's go into the expensive one, unfortunately. Charismatic Conqueror is really, really cool. I do really like it. Whenever your opponents play artifacts or creatures, they have to either put them tapped down, which is exactly what you want in this deck, or they got to give you 1/1 vampires, which is also exactly what you want in this deck. So you really, really benefit either side on this situation. I like this card. People have suggested it in cubes and stuff, but I think outside of using super aggro decks, and especially in the vampire kindred decks, it's just not as great. But here, I think it's just very, very good. It is a bit of a budget concern. I will see that. I do see that. But outside of that, I think it's a very, very strong inclusion. After which, I have no other cards to suggest, but I do really suggest going through and finding a bunch of like if you still have cuts that you need to switch out, finding a bunch of 1 mana or 2 mana vampires. Even if they're not amazingly good, play any of them that you can, because they're just going to be so, so worthwhile that every time you cast them, you get a vampire. Because if you cast 3 2/2s versus like 2 3/3s, you're up on vampires by a tremendous amount. If you play 1 5/5 or 2 2/2s, once again, you've gone a lot wider. And you have to remember, all of your win conditions generally have to do with you going wide. Obelisk of Erd doesn't do much if you don't go wide. Coat of Arms, especially, Eldrazi Monument, Bolas' Citadel's Drain effect. Well, not Drain, or Damage effect. And even things like Kindred Charge, or, let's see, our new Blood Artist and Cruel Celebrant effects also want you to go wide. So you're very much so incentivized to go as wide as possible, which with as many low mana cards as you can. So that's the suggestions. And those are my suggestions for the deck. This has been a shorter video. I think this deck feels a bit more of a first draft or a proof of concept for a deck that I think there's just so many different versions of. Maybe this deck was created with a few things in mind. Maybe this was built a bit off of EDH Rec. I don't know. That's the trick. People don't tend to tell me how they built the deck. And if they don't, I don't know what they wanted to do with this. But I think this deck can grow in a lot of different directions, and it can do a lot of good things. And it can be immensely strong. It's Edgar Markov. He's so, so powerful. You have so much you can do. But at this point, with our mana count and our mana value for a lot of spells, we gotta tighten everything up, right? We gotta fix the mana, and we gotta cut out some high mana stuff. And after that, we have a lot of directions we can go into, and we can build your preferred version of a vampire deck. If you want this vampire deck to very much so be about life gain, which I can see there's pieces of, but I just don't have the means to go and talk about right now because there's so many other things we need to work out, we can go back and we can re-examine this kind of thing. Life gain is not a bad direction. By adding Zulaport, Cutthroat, Blood Artist, we are gaining life. Bastion of Remembrance, we're gaining so much life, so we can go into that theme, but first we have to clean up a few things. I hope this video was helpful to you. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, you can do in the video description down below, or you can send me any draft of the deck. And if you want that draft to be, worked on sooner rather than later, there is a link for that down there too. If you could like, comment, subscribe, I'd be very, very appreciative. The channel is still growing and all of your support is very, very important to me. I hope this deck goes in the direction you want it to, and I hope to see it again. All right, good luck.